Some truths are not written to be shared, they are buried to be forgotten. They live in the margins of burned manuscripts, carved into the walls of temples that no longer exist, and whispered in the language of symbols rather than words. What you hold in your hands is not a story, nor a teaching, nor a sacred scripture. It is a dissection of the invisible system that has orchestrated human belief since the dawn of thought, a system that thrives not on matter, but on worship, devotion, and the electricity of your most intimate emotions. Most will never question it. Most will kneel their entire lives and call it faith. But you are here, and that means something in you already suspects the truth. Worship was never about salvation, it was about consumption. From the dawn of recorded history, humans have built temples, raised monuments, and knelt in the dust before forces they could neither see nor understand. They called them gods, spirits, ancestors, creators, and believed themselves small in their presence. But behind the poetry and the hymns, something else was happening. Those forces were not merely listening, they were feeding on fear, on faith, on the ecstatic surrender of billions of hearts. Every ritual, every prayer, every sacrifice was a transaction, and humanity, unknowingly, was always the offering on the altar. It is an idea so vast, so unsettling, that the mind resists it. We want to believe we are free. We want to believe that worship is an act of love, that obedience is a choice, that the forces we serve are benevolent. But beneath the gilded language of religion and the poetic veils of myth, there is a cold, mechanical truth. Where attention goes, energy flows, and where energy flows, something is fed. This is not superstition. It is physics, and those who understood it built empires, not on land or gold, but on devotion itself. Over centuries, the altars have changed shape. The temples became churches, the priests became politicians, the sacrifices became psychological. Blood offerings gave way to time spent, emotions spilled, and minds bent in obedience. What once required a stone altar and a chanting priest, now requires only a glowing screen and a distracted mind. The names of the gods changed: Yahweh, Allah, progress, productivity, love, nation, self. But the function remained the same: to harvest human energy and feed the structures that tower above us. This work does not ask you to believe in gods, quite the opposite. It invites you to strip away the costumes and witness what hides beneath them. Whether you call them archons, egregores, collective thought forms, or ancient parasites, the mechanism is the same. Humanity's emotions are food, its attention is fuel, its worship is currency. And until you see the machinery, you are not a worshipper, you are a crop. What follows in these pages is not speculation but revelation, the anatomy of an invisible economy that has dictated the shape of civilization. Once you see it, you will never be able to look at a prayer, a ritual, or even a fleeting thought the same way again. L1. The Forgotten Altars. Before there were nations, there were circles of stone. Before laws were carved, fires were kept burning through the night so that the unseen would not forget us. Humanity's first architecture was not the house but the altar, an axis where the fragile animal could face the fathomless sky and attempt an exchange. Offerings were simple at first: grain, smoke, a portion of the hunt laid on a flat rock, the open palm, the bowed head, the breath held in reverence. These gestures were not theater, they were transmissions. Every ember, every scent, every whispered word was a carrier wave sent into the dark, a message to whatever presence these early people felt moving behind weather and chance. We imagine them ignorant. We are wrong. The oldest rituals were not born from superstition alone, but from feedback. They petitioned, and the world replied. Rain after drought, a hunt unexpectedly plentiful, a fever that finally broke. When something answers, you continue to speak to it. Thus the altar was established as a technology of relation, a place designed to focus attention, compress emotion, and intensify intention, then project it outward. The first priests were not lawmakers. They were technicians of the invisible, tuning human feeling the way one tunes a drum, calibrating rhythm, smoke, chant, and fear to reach whatever lived just beyond the ridge of perception. What the altar perfected was concentration. A single mind is a candle, a gathered people is a blaze. The circle, the rhythm, the choreography of standing and kneeling and repeating, these were not random customs, but a method to synchronize many nervous systems into one coherent beam. Attention became current, current became offering. With the altar, humanity discovered that experience could be distilled into a potency, and that this potency would not dissipate if it was given a mouth to flow through. Every culture named the mouths differently: ancestor, spirit, storm lord, sun bearer, but the mechanism remained, the many feeding the one through focused devotion. In the beginning the exchange was intimate, almost symmetrical. Gratitude for harvest, blessing for child, protection for the journey, small vows answered by small mercies. But symmetry is fragile. As populations grew, altars grew with them. Hills were leveled, platforms raised, steps multiplied skyward so that more bodies could climb, more throats could chant, more fear and awe could be poured into the same opening. Where there is traffic, there will be roads. Where there is offering, there will be apparatus. Stone became system. Ritual became policy. The altar ceased to be a hearth and became a hub, a point through which whole cities learned to root their hopes and anxieties. The shift is subtle to describe but violent in consequence. Reverence became dependence. If the rains did not come, the solution was not to plant wiser or steward better. It was to feed the altar harder. If the enemy advanced, the answer was not to negotiate but to heap more life upon the slab. The more a people tied their survival to appeasing the unseen, the more the unseen's appetite swelled and the stories told about it. Gods became jealous, wrathful, never satisfied, adjectives that reveal less about divinity and more about a pipeline that could not be allowed to run dry. An altar that empties is a city that panics. Better to stoke it always. Look closely, and you'll see that the altar was never merely a symbol. It was infrastructure. It organized time, festivals, fasts, hours of prayer. It organized space, high places, inner sanctums, forbidden courts. It organized feeling, what may be expressed and when, what must be hidden and how. Most of all, it organized attention, because attention is the only tender that can be minted in any amount and still retain value to the unseen. Blood was spectacular but finite. Attention renews every morning. The earliest elites understood. Control the altar, and you do not need to control the people directly. They will bring you their energy themselves. Call it holiness, and feel grateful to be emptied. We inherit their stone and story, but forget the contract. We stroll through ruins and call them temples, as if they were built to house the human crowd. In truth, they were engines to house the human charge. Even the humble household shrine, the notch in a wall where a lamp burned, was a local node of a larger circuit, a way to keep the line open, to make sure the current never fell to zero. A people can change language, garments, God's names. The altar persists because the need it answers persists. To make sense of contingency by feeding something that might bend it. And somewhere along the line the question of what is being fed became impolite to ask. This is why we begin here. Not with doctrines, not with names, but with the first table set in the open air. The altar is the primordial interface between the human nervous system and the forces it cannot see but must negotiate with to survive. It couples our deepest effects, fear, awe, longing, to a focal point and assures us that our giving lands. Perhaps it does. But once an interface exists, anything that can receive will come to the port. The forgotten altars are forgotten only by us. On the other side of that opening, nothing forgets a mouth that feeds it. As civilizations rose from scattered tribes, the altar followed them, evolving, mutating, growing in complexity just as language and law did. It was no longer just a stone under the open sky, but a temple crowned with gold, a ziggurat clawing toward the heavens, a cathedral vaulting so high that even the act of looking upward became an act of submission. Yet beneath the marble and incense the same ancient logic pulsed. Give and you will be seen. Feed and you will be spared. Humanity's most monumental achievements were, at their core, vast and sophisticated feeding systems. Not just for gods, but for the idea of gods, for the very concept of a reality that requires our devotion to keep functioning. And the more we built, the more the line blurred between worship and enslavement. A ritual that once meant connection slowly became obligation. What began as gratitude turned into fear. Fear of drought, fear of plague, fear of divine silence, and fear, that primal electric fuel, became the most coveted offering of all. It burned brighter than any incense, cut deeper than any sacrifice. When fear was offered en masse, it created currents of energy so intense they seemed to alter the course of storms, tilt the outcomes of wars, and shape the destinies of empires. Whether or not the gods were real ceased to matter. The results of believing they were became undeniable. Across the ancient world, from the temples of Mesopotamia to the sanctuaries of Greece, one pattern repeats. The moment humanity organized itself, it organized around something to feed. Kings claimed their right to rule as granted by divine favor, and thus obedience to them became obedience to heaven. Wars were fought not just over land, but to prove whose god was stronger, whose altar more deserving of fuel, and with each generation the exchange deepened. Life itself was poured into the system. Crops, animals, captives, children, all became accepted currencies in this unspoken economy of feeding. Civilizations prided themselves on their devotion, never realizing that their very identities were being shaped by the demands of something they could not see. But here lies the most subtle deception. The altar's hunger does not end with literal offerings. Over time, the sacrifices shifted inward. People began to offer their obedience, their guilt, their unworthiness. They learned to sacrifice their joy and their desires, to mutilate their instincts, to kneel before invisible judgments and surrender their will. These, too, were offerings, and far more potent than blood. A civilization that fears its gods is easier to shape than one that fears its enemies. A mind that believes it is inherently flawed is easier to guide than one that trusts its own divinity. Slowly, imperceptibly, the altar migrated from the temple into the psyche. Humanity no longer needed to be told to kneel, it knelt on its own. We are taught to see these developments as spiritual evolution, as evidence of growing sophistication. But what if it is the opposite? What if every step of this progress has been a refinement of the same mechanism, a more efficient way to harvest human energy without resistance? The early altars demanded bodies. The modern ones demand belief, yet the result is identical. The same current, the same transmission, the same invisible mouth drinking deeply from the well of human attention. And just as empires rose around temples, entire civilizations now orbit around ideologies, religions, and systems that perform the same function. They focus, intensify, and channel human devotion toward a point that remains perpetually hungry. Look closer at the rituals that surround you today, not the ancient ones carved in stone, but the everyday ceremonies of modern life. The calendar that tells you when to celebrate and when to mourn, the institutions that define what is sacred and what is profane, the narratives that tell you what is worthy of striving for and what is worthy of punishment. These are altars in another form. They do not burn animals or spill blood, but they devour time, attention, and emotion. They shape what you fear and what you love. They demand your most precious offering, the story you tell yourself about who you are and what your life is for. And just as in ages past, the question we have stopped asking remains the most dangerous one: who exactly is being fed? Are these structures serving us, or are we serving them? Are the altars we gather around built for our evolution or for our containment? The forgotten altars were never truly abandoned. They were internalized, and because they are now hidden within our cultures, our languages, and our very sense of self, we no longer see them as altars at all. We see them as reality, and that, perhaps, is the most ingenious trick of all. There is a story buried deep beneath every civilization's myth, one older than any religion and more persistent than any empire. It is the story of exchange, of humans giving and something beyond them taking. At first, the transaction seemed fair. The rains followed the sacrifices, the crops grew after the prayers, the dead were honored and the living were spared. But as millennia passed, the price of that exchange grew heavier, and the returns less certain. Humanity began to pour more and more of itself into the void, not just offerings, not just prayers, but entire identities. We didn't merely feed the gods, we became the food. This is why the first altars matter. They are not historical curiosities. They are the blueprint of a hidden relationship that still governs human life. A relationship between those who generate energy and those who consume it. It does not matter if you name them gods, egregores, archons, or archetypes. The pattern remains unchanged. Humanity directs its most potent forces outward, believing it is honoring something greater, while rarely questioning where that energy truly flows. And just as rivers carve valleys over ages, this continuous outpouring has shaped the collective psyche, carving deep grooves of obedience, dependence, and unconscious devotion into our very nature. You see it in the way people still kneel, even without temples. You see it in how billions wake up each day to serve systems they did not create, chasing ideals they did not choose, seeking approval from authorities they do not understand. You see it in the way we burn our time, our vitality, our very life force on the altars of corporations, nations, ideologies, and relationships, convinced that if we just sacrifice a little more, we will finally be safe, loved, or saved. These are not new behaviors. They are ancient rituals, dressed in modern clothes, flowing from the same primal impulse that once placed fruit and blood at the feet of unseen powers. And here lies the most unsettling truth. The altars never needed our offerings. We needed to believe they did, because the moment we stopped feeding them, the illusion of their power would dissolve. What sustains them is not their inherent might, but our unconscious agreement that they are worthy of it. Like a parasite that cannot survive without a host, the altars require us to continue the cycle, to offer, to believe, to fear, to obey, and as long as we do, the system remains invisible, embedded not in temples of stone but in the architecture of our own minds. But cracks are beginning to show. Some are starting to remember that the altar was always a mirror, that what we have been worshipping is a distorted projection of our own creative force. It is not that gods do not exist, but that their existence is bound to the energy we feed them. Withdraw that energy and they wither. Reclaim it, and they collapse. This is the first act of rebellion, the seed of liberation. To recognize the forgotten altars for what they truly are, conduits not destinies, tools not masters. And so the question becomes not whether altars will exist, but who they will serve. Will you continue to unconsciously pour your essence into systems that feed upon it, or will you take that essence back and offer it to something worthy? Perhaps to your own evolution, your own awakening, your own divine potential. The forgotten altars whisper a chilling truth across time. You have always been the source, and until you remember this, you will keep bowing to reflections of your own power, mistaking them for gods. Now we stand at the threshold of a deeper revelation, one that will unravel the most guarded secret of all, that what they feed upon most is not blood, nor offerings, nor prayers, but fear itself, and that fear, institutionalized and refined, has become the richest feast in the universe. L2. The currency of fear. If the altars were humanity's first unconscious contract, then fear was the ink with which that contract was written. Long before organized religion, before laws and kings, before language itself could name the gods, fear was the primal current that tethered humanity to forces it could not understand. It is fear that taught the first human to bow before thunder, to kneel before fire, to offer blood to the storm in the hope it would pass him by. And it is fear, not love, not reverence, that still underlies the vast majority of what we call worship today. The altars may have changed shape, but the fuel has not. What the gods desire most is not your devotion, it is the trembling pulse beneath it. Because fear is the most potent energy consciousness can emit. Unlike love, which expands, or curiosity, which explores, fear contracts, and in that contraction it concentrates. It tightens the field, collapses possibility, and binds the mind to singular points of fixation. When fear is present, attention narrows. Awareness stops wandering. Energy becomes predictable, directed, controllable. This is why predatory systems, both natural and metaphysical, seek it. A fearful human is a domesticated one. A fearful collective is an obedient one. And a civilization governed by fear will feed its gods without ever questioning what it is they consume. The ancient priesthoods understood this long before science could measure cortisol or map the limbic system. They learned that terror and awe are two sides of the same coin, and that if they could control a population's fears, they could harvest its energy without lifting a sword. The myths were crafted accordingly. The heavens were populated with wrathful deities who demanded sacrifice, jealous gods who punished disobedience, monstrous forces that lurked just beyond the village walls. And with each terrifying story, another layer of obedience was woven into the human psyche. To disobey was not merely dangerous, it was unthinkable. To question was not simply rebellion, it was blasphemy. And so fear became institutionalized, woven into the fabric of culture itself. It hid behind noble names, faith, law, tradition, order. But the mechanism was always the same. Fear of divine wrath kept temples filled. Fear of eternal punishment kept moral codes unchallenged. Fear of exile kept tribes cohesive. Even now, in the age of reason, fear wears new masks but plays the same role. Fear of failure fuels the economy. Fear of judgment drives conformity. Fear of scarcity keeps humanity chained to endless labor. The altars of stone have been replaced by glowing screens and corporate towers, but the sacrifice remains unchanged. Our energy, offered willingly, to avoid the shadows that haunt us. Yet the most dangerous fear of all is not of gods or governments, it is of our own power. Because if humanity were ever to see itself clearly, if it were to understand that the same divine spark it projects outward as God is alive within every cell, the entire architecture of control would disintegrate. This is why fear must be carefully maintained. It must be woven into childhood through punishment and shame. It must be embedded in society through competition and scarcity. It must be disguised as wisdom, as caution, as reality, anything to keep you from remembering that you are not a trembling servant, but a sovereign creator. And so, century after century, fear continues to flow upward, invisible offerings carried on the breath of anxious prayers and sleepless nights, on the weight of unpaid bills and unspoken dreams. The harvest is constant because the mechanism is invisible. Most will never suspect that their deepest anxieties are not just chemical reactions, but tributaries feeding an ancient economy, one that thrives on their disempowerment. And until that realization dawns, humanity will continue to pay the tax of terror generation after generation, mistaking it for the price of safety. But if fear is the currency, attention is the mint, and the moment you learn where your gaze goes, your energy flows, the entire system begins to unravel. In the next chapter, we step into the true marketplace of the gods, where every thought, every prayer, every heartbeat becomes a unit of nourishment, the harvest of attention. To understand why fear is so valuable, you must first grasp how consciousness behaves under its spell. Fear is not just an emotion, it is a sculptor of reality. It shapes perception, distorts memory, and rewires the very architecture of the mind. In its presence, humans relinquish discernment and trade sovereignty for safety. They look outward for authority, inward for fault, and upward for salvation. Entire civilizations have been built on this reflex, the instinct to seek protection from what they believe they cannot face. And those who position themselves as protectors, priests, kings, ideologies, even invisible gods, know that the more fear they can sustain, the more devotion they can command. The genius of the system lies in its subtlety. Fear does not need to roar to be effective, it whispers. It does not have to manifest as terror. A low-grade hum of anxiety is often more efficient. A society that trembles in panic will eventually rebel, but a society kept in chronic unease will exhaust itself before it ever questions the source. This is why fear is now embedded in the smallest corners of life. It is the fear of disappointing others that keeps you overworking, the fear of being judged that keeps you silent, the fear of being alone that keeps you in toxic relationships. These are not random emotions, they are invisible tithes, paid daily into an ancient energetic economy. Consider how religions mastered this art. The fear of hell was not just a threat, it was a psychological lever, ensuring that believers would not only obey, but also police one another. The fear of divine judgment guaranteed internalized control long after the priests were gone. Even modern institutions follow the same script. Governments invoke fear of enemies to justify endless wars. Media weaponize fear of disaster to keep attention captive. Corporations exploit fear of inadequacy to sell products. In each case, the result is the same: a population too distracted by imagined dangers to notice where its energy is flowing. But beneath all these external fears lies a deeper one: the existential terror of non-existence. Humanity's oldest mythologies are saturated with it. The fear of death, of dissolution, of disappearing into nothingness. It is this primal dread that makes humans cling to narratives of salvation and immortality, offering their obedience in exchange for a promise of continuity. The gods, whatever name you give them, have always understood this. They do not need to prove their power. They need only offer escape from the abyss, and in that offer they are fed. Yet fear has another function, more insidious and more powerful. It is a cage that teaches the mind its own limitations. When a child is punished for curiosity, fear teaches them not to question. When love is withdrawn for disobedience, fear teaches them to conform. When society shames them for failure, fear teaches them not to try. Layer by layer, these lessons form an internal prison more effective than any chains. The body moves freely, but the will does not, and once the will is subdued, the flow of energy becomes predictable, an endless stream directed toward external authorities that promise safety in exchange for submission. This is why every transformative path begins not with knowledge, but with courage. Until you face the architecture of your own fear, until you trace each anxious thought back to the altar it serves, you will continue to feed what enslaves you. And here lies the paradox. Fear is powerless once it is seen. It thrives in shadow, but dissolves under the light of awareness. The moment you recognize that fear is not a divine command but a designed mechanism, the contract begins to crack. But to truly break the system, awareness is not enough. You must reclaim the force that fear hijacked, your attention. For attention is the conduit through which all energy flows. It is the lifeblood of both creation and control, and those who know how to direct it rule the world. In the next page, we will trace how this single faculty, more precious than gold, more powerful than armies, became the centerpiece of the gods' harvest. Fear is a currency precisely because it purchases compliance, not just in behavior but in belief. It convinces entire populations to surrender their birthright as creators and accept the role of powerless petitioners. It persuades individuals to believe they are fragile, sinful, incomplete, or broken, and then offers them a savior, a doctrine, a product, or a system to make them whole again. The brilliance of this architecture is that it makes you pay twice. Once with your suffering and once with your devotion. You become both the source of the problem and the source of the solution, trapped in a self-perpetuating economy that never allows you to see beyond its walls. But there is an even deeper layer to this dynamic, one that transcends politics, religion, and commerce. At its core, fear is not just an emotion, it is a frequency. It vibrates at a specific resonance that is highly consumable by non-physical intelligences. Be they archons, egregores, or collective thought forms, they do not need temples or tithes, because the very vibration of fear sustains them. It is a nutrient, a fuel, a signal that binds them to the human field. And because fear collapses the soul's natural expansiveness, it keeps consciousness dense and slow, easier to shape and manipulate. This is why fear is not simply useful, it is essential. Without it, the architecture of control collapses under its own weight. The irony is that humanity's deepest fears are illusions, often constructed or amplified by the very systems that profit from them. The fear of death ignores the soul's immortality. The fear of unworthiness ignores the inherent divinity within every being. The fear of separation ignores the unity that underlies all existence. These fears are like shadows on the wall, terrifying only until you turn and see the small flickering flame that casts them. But as long as you believe the shadows are real, you will keep offering your energy to keep them at bay, and the gods, whatever form they take, will feast on that offering as if it were ambrosia. Once you begin to see this, everything changes. You start to notice how fear hides in language, in the word should, in the phrase what if, in the constant whisper of not enough. You see how it shapes your decisions, steering you away from potential and toward safety. You feel how it manifests in the body, the tightening chest, the shallow breath, the contracted gut, each sensation a small altar where your life force is being spent, and you realize that fear is not an external invader but an internal agreement. It is the choice to believe in your smallness rather than your source. To break the spell, you must do something radical. Stop paying. Not by denying fear, not by pretending it isn't there, but by meeting it with the one force it cannot consume, awareness. When you sit in the presence of fear without obeying it, you starve the parasitic structures it sustains. When you choose curiosity over avoidance, love over control, creation over safety, you redirect your energy inward, back to the sovereign center where it belongs. This is the beginning of emancipation. Yet even when fear dissolves, the mechanism of control does not disappear. It evolves, because beyond fear lies the most sophisticated method of all, the manipulation of attention. If fear binds the mind, attention directs the soul, and whoever controls where you place your gaze, your thoughts, your longing, controls where your energy flows. In the next chapter, we uncover the most subtle altar ever built, the harvest of attention, where humanity's collective focus itself becomes the banquet of the gods. L3. The harvest of attention. If fear is the currency of the gods, then attention is their gold. It is the purest, most concentrated form of human energy, the alchemical essence from which all creation springs. Where attention goes, energy flows. Where energy flows, reality takes shape. This is not poetry, it is the first law of consciousness, and it is precisely why every system that has ever ruled humanity, from ancient temples to modern algorithms, has sought not merely to influence attention, but to own it. Because once your gaze is captured, once your focus is tethered, the work of control is complete. You become the architect of your own prison, brick by brick, thought by thought, unaware that the blueprint was handed to you long before you were old enough to question it. The ancients understood this truth well. They knew that attention is the bridge between the inner and outer worlds, the force that gives shape to both prayer and prophecy. This is why temples were designed to awe, why rituals were crafted to mesmerize, why myths were written to captivate the imagination. Every incense cloud, every chant, every flicker of sacred flame was an instrument to direct human attention upward, toward a divine image, a celestial order, a power beyond themselves. And with that upward gaze came a downward flow of energy, a continuous offering of consciousness itself. The gods did not need to lift a finger. Humanity willingly poured its awareness into their waiting chalice. Today, the temples look different, but the harvest has only grown more sophisticated. Your attention is tracked, traded, and monetized with more precision than any priesthood could have dreamed. Corporations design entire ecosystems to keep your eyes glued to screens. Politicians craft crises to capture your focus and steer it toward their agendas. Spiritual movements promise enlightenment if only you follow their every teaching. Even relationships, the most intimate of human bonds, often become subtle contracts of attention, with each party vying for the gaze of the other as if it were proof of their own worth. You believe you are choosing where to look, but in truth, most of your attention is not yours at all. It has been hijacked. And this theft has consequences far beyond distraction. Attention is not passive, it is a creative force. To place it upon something is to feed it, to strengthen it, to weave it deeper into the fabric of reality. This is why myths endure for millennia, why ideologies outlive their founders, why systems of control remain stable even when everyone knows they are corrupt. They endure because attention sustains them. Like embers fed by oxygen, they flare brighter with every glance, every conversation, every thought. Even resistance, if fueled by fixation, becomes nourishment. The gods do not care whether you love them or hate them, worship them or curse them. All they require is that you cannot stop thinking about them. This is the hidden genius of the harvest. It is voluntary. Unlike fear, which must be imposed, attention is freely given. You hand it over with every scroll, every outrage, every obsessive thought about what you despise. You place it on the altar each time you obsess over those who wronged you, each time you replay old wounds, each time you debate illusions that were designed to keep you engaged. And in that act of fixation, you participate in your own exploitation. The gods do not need your obedience, they only need your gaze. But there is a deeper reason why attention is so precious. It is the closest expression of divine will available to a human being. To direct it consciously is to remember your own godhood, the ability to shape worlds, to collapse potential into form, to breathe meaning into the void. This is the power humanity was meant to wield, the birthright that was never truly lost, only redirected. And this is why every system of control must keep you from mastering it, because the moment you do, you stop feeding their world and start creating your own. The question is not whether you are offering your attention. You are every second of every day. The question is to whom, and until that question is answered honestly, the harvest continues. But to understand the full scale of this mechanism, how deeply it reaches into every facet of existence, we must look beyond the surface distractions and trace how entire civilizations have been designed to funnel human focus toward the same invisible feast. That story begins long before the modern world, in the very architecture of control itself. In the earliest days of civilization, the harvest was not hidden. It was celebrated. Great ziggurats and towering pyramids were erected not merely as monuments of stone, but as focal points of collective awareness. Entire cities were designed as conduits to channel the gaze of millions toward a single sacred center. Pilgrims walked for weeks to witness a statue or a ritual that, unbeknownst to them, served not only as a symbol of devotion, but as a mechanism of energy collection. The priests understood what the people did not. Attention is a current, and when aligned, it becomes a river capable of nourishing even the invisible. They were not worshipping stone idols. They were feeding something far beyond their comprehension, a field of consciousness that grew more potent with every pair of eyes turned toward it. The same principle evolved as societies changed. Monarchies claimed divine right not because kings were divine, but because belief made them so. Flags and symbols became extensions of this mechanism. Attention anchors that transformed cloth into power, words into law, and myths into unquestionable reality. And as humanity's world expanded, so too did the sophistication of the harvest. The gods no longer needed temples of stone. They built temples in the human mind. Ideologies, dogmas, identities, and narratives so compelling that people would defend them as if their very lives depended on it, and in a sense they did. Because where attention goes, reality follows, and if your attention is bound to a system, so too is your existence. In the digital age, this ancient machinery has reached its most refined form. What were once altars are now screens. What were once chants are now algorithms. The priesthood has become invisible, a vast automated intelligence that knows your impulses better than you do, and uses them to capture, direct, and monetize your focus. Every click, every notification, every headline is a hook, a modern prayer wheel, designed to keep your awareness cycling endlessly through the same loops of outrage, desire, and fear. And each loop, each moment of fixation, is an offering on the altar of a God you do not even know you serve. But there is something far more profound at work beneath the surface of this manipulation. Attention does not merely sustain systems, it births them. This is the unspoken secret of reality itself. The collective focus of billions creates psychic structures, egregores, that grow stronger, more autonomous, and more influential with every thought directed toward them. Nations, corporations, religions, even cultural movements, all are egregores, fed and animated by the energy of attention. Remove that energy and they wither. Redirect it and they transform. Feed them with fear and they become tyrants. Feed them with reverence and they become gods. Humanity has always been the gardener of its own invisible pantheon. It simply forgot that it was planting seeds. This is why even rebellion must be approached carefully. To oppose something with obsession is still to feed it. To spend hours railing against corruption, to endlessly debate lies, to fight institutions on their own terms, all of this sustains what you wish to destroy. The harvest is indifferent to polarity. It does not care whether you are for or against, only that you are engaged. And so many revolutions fail not because they are weak, but because they never leave the field. They remain trapped within the same circuits of attention that give their oppressors strength. The parasite thrives even as you attempt to kill it, because it drinks deeply from the energy of your hatred. To break this cycle is not to withdraw from the world, but to reclaim the sovereign direction of your awareness. It is to become deliberate, to choose what you look at, what you think about, what you speak into being. It is to ask before every fixation, does this feed what I wish to see grow? Because every headline you read, every story you repeat, every enemy you obsess over, these are seeds, and the field of reality will grow whatever you water with your focus. In this way, attention is not merely a resource, it is a weapon, a compass, a key, and when humanity learns once again to wield it with precision, the harvesters will find themselves starving. Yet for most, this realization is not enough. Even knowing that attention shapes reality, they remain caught in the same loops, unable to look away. Why? Because the architecture built to harvest attention is not external alone. It lives within the psyche itself. It is encoded into how humans define meaning, how they experience time, how they seek validation. The gods do not only sit on thrones above, they whisper from the depths within, and to understand how they have so deeply woven their feeding trough into the fabric of existence, we must look at the structure they built to contain it, the architecture of control. The more one studies history, the clearer this pattern becomes. Wherever there is worship, there is harvest, and wherever there is harvest, there is control. The priests of Babylon, the pharaohs of Egypt, the emperors of Rome all understood a fundamental truth about human nature. That awareness is not just observation, it is participation. The moment you direct your attention toward a story, you become part of it. And if that story is designed to keep you afraid, ashamed, or dependent, then your very act of noticing binds you to its gravity. This is why every empire has sought not only to conquer land, but to capture the narrative, to control the symbols, to dictate what people dream of and what they fear. Because once they have the gaze, they no longer need the chains. The people will build the walls of their own cage. This is the hidden reason why religions demanded constant prayer, why citizens were taught to swear allegiance daily, why even modern platforms crave your endless scrolling. It was never simply about belief, it was about bandwidth. A mind consumed by dogma has no capacity left to question it. A society hooked on spectacle no longer remembers how to imagine alternatives. And a soul perpetually feeding external idols forgets that the most sacred altar is within. What looks like devotion is often nothing more than domesticated attention, consciousness itself shackled and repurposed for ends it does not choose. But here lies the paradox that the ancient initiates new, and that modern humanity is only beginning to rediscover. The same attention that feeds the parasite can also starve it. The same awareness that fuels systems of domination can dismantle them. It is not the gods who are powerful, it is the gaze of billions that makes them so. Withdraw that gaze and empires crumble, redirect it inward, and the scaffolding of control begins to dissolve. What you stare at becomes stronger. What you ignore loses form, and what you consciously choose to behold begins to shape reality itself. This is why true revolution does not begin with weapons or protests. It begins with attention discipline. It begins when you stop praying to what you fear, when you refuse to offer your outrage to the idols of division, when you step back from the carnival of distraction and reclaim your gaze as something sacred. It is a slow and subtle rebellion, but it is unstoppable. Because once you know how the harvest works, you no longer wander blindly into the fields. You become the one who plants. You become the one who decides which gods live and which dissolve back into the void. And this is the most dangerous secret of all, the one hidden in plain sight. Humanity has never been the cattle. It has always been the gardener. The divine parasites do not descend from on high to feast upon us. They are grown from our own fixation, sculpted from our attention, sustained by our willingness to offer the most sacred substance we possess, our awareness, to altars that give nothing back, and the moment enough of us look away, they starve. The moment enough of us stop praying to fear, the temple falls. The moment we remember that attention is the primal currency of creation, the harvest ends and a new reality begins. But to truly understand how deeply this has been woven into our existence, we must examine the larger system built around it, the machinery that ensures the harvest never stops, and that the gods' banquet is always plentiful. To do that, we now step beyond the simple act of worship into the architecture that sustains it, the design of control itself. L4. The architecture of control. If attention is the harvest, then control is the irrigation system, the intricate network designed to guide, contain, and redirect the flow of human energy so that it always returns to the same source. From the moment humanity began to form tribes and civilizations, those who understood the mechanics of belief understood that control was most effective when invisible. It was never about chains on wrists or swords at throats. The most enduring empires were not built by brute force, but by architecture so subtle that the enslaved would mistake their cage for the world itself. True control does not confine the body, it defines the possible. Look closely at the oldest temples and monuments, and you'll see more than stone and symbol. You'll see circuitry. Each pillar, each corridor, each sacred direction was designed to shape how humans thought, how they felt, how they perceived reality. The priests who stood at the center of those temples were not merely religious figures, they were engineers of consciousness. They knew that to feed their gods consistently, people had to not only pray but need to pray. They had to believe that without ritual they would be punished, that without sacrifice the crops would fail, that without obedience chaos would swallow them whole. Fear was the foundation, but structure was the scaffolding. And once that structure was in place, it did not need guards. The believers policed themselves. Over time, this architecture evolved, shifting from stone altars to parchment laws, from priestly decrees to political constitutions, from sermons to screens. Yet the function remained the same: to define the edges of what humanity could question, and to punish those who stepped beyond. Kings claimed divine right to rule, weaving the authority of gods into the hierarchy of men. Religions codified morality, teaching generations that deviation was sin, that curiosity was heresy, that to look beyond the veil was to risk eternal damnation. Even modern institutions, governments, corporations, media networks, are merely the latest temples, built not of marble but of narratives, rituals, and systems designed to channel your energy toward their altars. It is tempting to think we have outgrown the old priesthoods, that we are too advanced to be swayed by myth. But the architecture of control has only become more elegant, more invisible, more insidious. Today, you do not kneel before a golden idol, you kneel before a glowing screen. You do not offer sacrifices of lambs and incense, you offer your data, your time, your outrage, your dreams. And just as the priests once told you that your obedience would secure a place in paradise, today you are told that endless productivity, constant engagement, and unwavering consumption will secure you a place in the algorithm's grace. The gods have not left, they have digitized. The temples have not fallen, they have gone online. The brilliance of this system is that it no longer needs to force anything upon you. Instead, it invites you to choose it over and over again. You scroll not because someone demands it, but because the design rewards you for doing so. You buy not because you are ordered to, but because the system convinces you that consumption is identity. You participate not because you are chained, but because the cage has been dressed as comfort. This is the final form of control, when the slave defends the master, when the captive clings to the bars, when the harvested thank the harvesters for their daily bread. And yet, even in the most elaborate prisons, cracks eventually appear. When enough people begin to sense the architecture instead of merely living inside it, the illusion weakens. The system relies on your unconscious cooperation, on your belief that there is no alternative. But if you can see the design, you can begin to question it. And if you can question it, you can step outside of it. The next layer of our descent reveals exactly how deep this system runs, and how it hides itself not just in temples and screens, but in the very stories you tell about what is good, loving, and divine. At the core of every empire, whether ruled by gods, kings, or algorithms, lies a single principle: control must never be perceived as control. This is the genius of the system that governs humanity's consciousness. If the chains are visible, people will fight to break them. But if they are disguised as protection, morality, purpose, or even love, they will be embraced, defended, and even celebrated. The most effective prison is the one whose inmates do not know they are imprisoned. And so the architects of control learned long ago that their greatest tools were not weapons, but ideas, narratives so deeply woven into the fabric of society that questioning them feels like questioning reality itself. Consider the architecture of religion. It teaches that obedience is virtue, that suffering is holy, and that questioning is sin. It tells you that you are born broken, that redemption can only be earned through submission, and that ultimate authority lies beyond you, in the hands of a distant, unseen power. This is not spirituality. It is design. It is a carefully constructed hierarchy that siphons your devotion upward while keeping you in a perpetual state of dependency and guilt. And it is not confined to temples and scriptures. Governments, too, cloak their control in language that sounds noble: security, justice, patriotism. Corporations speak of freedom and choice, even as they manufacture addiction and dependency. Every layer of the system speaks in words that soothe, but each word is a chain. Even your own sense of self is shaped by this architecture. From the moment you are born, you are given a name, a nationality, a gender, a set of beliefs and values. These are presented not as choices but as truths. You learn which desires are acceptable and which are shameful, which ambitions are noble and which are selfish, which questions are encouraged and which are forbidden. By the time you reach adulthood, the cage is no longer external. It is internalized. You police yourself before anyone else has to. You censor your thoughts before they form into words. You shrink your dreams before they threaten the order you were taught to protect. This is not coincidence. It is the culmination of thousands of years of psychological architecture, a cathedral built inside the human psyche itself. And yet, the most brilliant aspect of this system is that it convinces you it does not exist. The believer calls their submission faith. The citizen calls their obedience duty. The consumer calls their addiction choice. Even the rebel, thinking they stand apart, often ends up playing the same game, railing against one altar while unknowingly kneeling before another. The architecture of control is not threatened by resistance that remains within its blueprint. In fact, it thrives on it. Outrage, rebellion, and even dissent become just another form of energy to be harvested, another way to keep your focus locked on the system itself. But here is the uncomfortable truth. No system of control can sustain itself without your participation. It does not matter how ancient the myths, how powerful the institutions, or how sophisticated the technology. If enough people withdraw their belief, the structure crumbles. It may not happen overnight, but the foundation will erode. This is why the architects work tirelessly to keep you distracted, divided, and dependent. They cannot afford for you to realize that you have always held the keys, and those keys do not lie in overthrowing the temples or burning the systems to the ground. They lie in the one place the architects cannot reach, your awareness. The shift begins not with rage, but with recognition. When you stop calling obedience virtue, when you stop mistaking fear for morality, when you stop outsourcing your power to invisible authorities, the architecture loses its grip. Its walls begin to dissolve the moment you remember that they were never built to contain your soul, only to shape your perception. And once perception is reclaimed, the structure no longer functions. But before we speak of liberation, we must face the final and most deceptive layer of all. The mask the system wears to hide its true nature. It is not tyranny or terror that keeps humanity obedient. It is love, or at least the appearance of it. The final layer of the structure, the one that has endured the rise and fall of empires, the rewriting of religions, and the evolution of technology, is the most insidious of all because it does not resemble control at all. It resembles care, it resembles purpose, it resembles love. This is the mask that keeps humanity willingly feeding the system that drains it. The belief that what imprisons us is also what protects us. No tyrant is as effective as the savior we refuse to question, and so control learned to wear the robes of compassion and the halo of virtue, convincing generations that obedience was not submission but safety, that sacrifice was not slavery but service. Think of how every mechanism of power disguises itself. Religions speak not of domination but of salvation. The flock must obey the shepherd because the shepherd loves them. Governments do not demand compliance, they protect their people. Corporations do not manufacture dependency, they empower consumers. Even the technologies that track, condition, and manipulate us are sold as tools for connection, personalized experiences, or a better future. This is no accident. It is the evolution of control to its highest form, a form that does not resist scrutiny because it anticipates and absorbs it, reshaping itself into whatever form you trust most. At its core, this mask exploits one of humanity's most beautiful qualities, the longing to belong, to serve, to be part of something greater than oneself. It takes the sacred impulse to love and weaponises it into obedience. It takes the yearning for truth and redirects it into dogma. It takes the soul's instinct to create and converts it into endless consumption. And because these impulses are real, because they come from a genuine place, the deception is nearly impossible to see. You are not coerced into participating, you choose to, believing you are doing something noble. But the energy flows the same way, and the harvest continues uninterrupted. Even those who awaken to one layer of the system often fall prey to another. They may reject organized religion, only to worship at the altar of ideology. They may abandon consumerism, only to become enslaved to a new form of asceticism. They may distrust governments, only to surrender their sovereignty to charismatic truth-tellers. Control has no preference for which temple you kneel before, only that you continue kneeling. It thrives on polarity, on opposition, on the illusion of choice between paths that all lead to the same destination. In this way, even rebellion becomes part of the design, a pressure valve that prevents the system from collapsing under its own weight. And yet, within this elegant deception lies its fatal flaw. It depends on your belief that the power lies anywhere but within you. The architecture collapses the moment you remember that no savior is coming, that no system can define your worth, that no external authority can grant or revoke your sovereignty. You are not here to serve the altars. You are the source from which they draw their strength. The temples stand because you believe in them. The gods feed because you offer yourself. Withdraw that offering and the mask slips. Withdraw your belief and the structure withers. This is the revelation the architects fear most, that you will stop asking for permission to exist, that you will stop confusing obedience with love, that you will stop kneeling before illusions and stand. Because once you do, the machinery of control grinds to a halt. The altars fall silent, the harvest ends, and what remains is not chaos but the forgotten truth. That power was never taken from you. It was only hidden, waiting for you to remember it was yours all along. And with that realization, we turn to the most deceptive disguise of all, the one that has convinced humanity to thank its captors for their chains, the mask of benevolence. L5. The mask of benevolence. The greatest trick power ever played was not convincing humanity that it was weak, it was convincing humanity that its submission was an act of virtue. Throughout history, the systems that fed upon our life force have learned to present themselves not as oppressors, but as guardians, not as parasites, but as protectors. They offer salvation while tightening their grip, promise freedom while defining its boundaries, and speak the language of love while quietly siphoning the soul. The hand that enslaves you most effectively is the one you believe is saving you. Consider the earliest civilizations. Their gods did not appear as tyrants demanding obedience under threat of annihilation. They were portrayed as loving creators, wise judges, merciful fathers, yet their love always came with conditions: sacrifice, devotion, unquestioning faith. The people believed they were serving the divine out of gratitude, when in truth they were fueling a machine that demanded their energy in exchange for safety. This same pattern echoes through every empire and every age. The monarch rules by divine right, the priest cares for your soul, the state ensures your security, each claims to serve you, but only if you kneel first. This is not merely deception, it is a calculated inversion of reality. The system understands that domination through fear alone is unsustainable. Fear provokes resistance, but domination through love disarms it. When authority cloaks itself in compassion, rebellion feels like betrayal. When the oppressor calls themselves your protector, disobedience feels immoral. The mind becomes its own jailer, policing thoughts and silencing doubts in the name of loyalty. And so the harvest continues, not because humanity is too blind to see, but because it has been taught to interpret its own chains as evidence of being loved. Even today, this mask is everywhere. Governments justify mass surveillance as keeping you safe. Corporations defend exploitative systems as empowering choice. Social platforms claim to connect humanity while mining every ounce of its attention for profit. Charitable organizations, religious movements, and political parties speak of service, community, and progress, and yet all of them depend on your continued participation to sustain their power. The language of benevolence softens the edges of control, turning the architecture of domination into something people will defend rather than destroy. But perhaps the most dangerous manifestation of this mask is the one you wear against yourself. It is the inner voice that tells you you're being responsible when you suppress your desires, that you're being selfless when you abandon your needs, that you're being good when you obey without question. This internalized control is the system's masterpiece, a self-sustaining loop where the enslaved not only accept their servitude, but believe it makes them virtuous. And in that belief, the harvest reaches its purest form, humans willingly giving their energy, their time, their devotion, not because they are forced, but because they are convinced it is the right thing to do. And yet, beneath the velvet mask, the machinery remains the same. Every act of devotion is still a transfer of energy. Every ritual of obedience is still an offering. Every time you say yes when your soul wants to scream no, the system grows stronger. To see the mask for what it is, to name it, to pierce it, is the beginning of liberation. But the mask is only one layer of the illusion. Behind it lies an even darker truth, that the harvest has always required sacrifice. Not symbolic sacrifice, not metaphorical surrender, but real, tangible offerings of life force, blood, time, and soul. And to understand how deep this rabbit hole goes, we must trace the machinery of sacrifice itself. From the beginning of civilization, sacrifice has been dressed in sacred robes. It has been painted as a holy act, a necessary bridge between mortals and gods. But beneath the hymns and incense, beneath the gilded temples and solemn prayers, the act of sacrifice has always served the same purpose: to sustain the hierarchy, to feed the system, to keep the machine alive. The mask of benevolence transforms extraction into devotion. It convinces you that giving yourself away is noble. In the ancient world, the sacrifice was literal. Blood was spilled on altars, hearts torn from chests, children offered to the flames, all under the belief that such gifts would ensure reign, fertility, victory. These rituals were not senseless brutality. They were carefully engineered exchanges, rooted in the belief that divine favor could be bought with human life. But look deeper, and a more unsettling pattern emerges. The gods never came to collect these offerings. The priests did. The institutions did. The structure that mediated between humanity and the divine was always the true recipient of the sacrifice. Over centuries, the form of sacrifice evolved, but the essence did not. As civilizations grew more civilized, blood became metaphor, yet the energy still flowed upward. Today, you no longer lay bodies on stone altars, but you sacrifice your time, your dreams, your vitality to corporations, nations, ideologies, and relationships that consume without giving back. You burn yourself out in jobs that feed you just enough to keep you dependent. You pour your emotional energy into relationships that demand loyalty but offer little growth. You silence your truth for acceptance, trade authenticity for belonging, and call it love. Every moment of self-abandonment is a ritual. Every compromise of your essence is an offering. This is the subtle brilliance of the mask. It teaches you to sanctify your own diminishment. To starve your soul becomes self-discipline. To suppress your desires becomes maturity. To endure abuse becomes patience. And because the system defines these sacrifices as virtues, you wear them like medals. Proud of the very acts that drain your life force, the system doesn't need to demand your devotion if it can convince you that devotion is who you are. The mask also thrives on inversion. It makes parasites look like providers. You are told the state gives you safety, but it first extracts your freedom. You are told religion offers salvation, but it first implants fear. You are told technology connects you, but it first isolates you from your inner world. Each gift has a price, and the price is always the same: sovereignty. The more you accept their blessings, the more you become dependent on their presence. Like a symbiotic host that cannot survive without the parasite it sustains, humanity clings to its oppressors because they have convinced it that life without them is impossible. And perhaps the most insidious mask of all is worn by the concept of goodness itself. Societies are structured to reward compliance with moral virtue. The good citizen pays taxes to sustain the machine. The good believer kneels to a God who requires worship to exist. The good worker sacrifices their hours to a system that commodifies their existence. Even rebellion is often absorbed and redirected, sanitized into slogans, monetized into trends, stripped of its revolutionary power. This is how the mask sustains itself, not by crushing opposition, but by redefining it into yet another form of offering. But there is a fracture in this illusion, a growing recognition that true benevolence does not demand obedience, that real love does not require sacrifice. The moment this truth is remembered, the spell begins to weaken, and in that crack of awareness, the machinery that has fed for millennia trembles, because its existence depends on one thing only: your continued willingness to give. And the most powerful rebellion you can commit is to stop offering yourself. Yet to do so, you must first understand the engine behind the mask, the ancient mechanism of sacrifice itself, and that is where the illusion becomes most grotesque. The engine of sacrifice has always been fueled by one primal belief: that you are not enough as you are. It is this wound, this deliberate implantation of insufficiency, that keeps the offerings flowing. The gods, the systems, the ideologies, they all whisper the same poison into your collective ear. You are flawed, you are guilty, you are weak. You must earn redemption. Once that lie takes root, you will crawl to their altars willingly, desperate to prove your worthiness, convinced that without their blessing you cannot survive. The greatest control is not physical chains, but the internalized belief that you deserve your cage. The manipulation is so deep that you often mistake the draining of your essence for spiritual growth. You work yourself to exhaustion and call it purpose. You obey unjust laws and call it order. You suppress your rage and call it forgiveness. You hand over the best parts of yourself, your passion, your vitality, your life force, and believe you are doing something holy. Yet if you look closely, you will see that nothing divine ever asked for these sacrifices. It was always the architecture of power, disguised as divinity, that required your surrender to sustain itself. And so, generation after generation, humanity repeats the same ceremony. It kneels before faceless masters, bleeding away its energy into causes that do not serve its evolution. This is not accidental. It is a precise design, because if you remain depleted, you remain docile. If you remain ashamed, you remain obedient. And if you remain convinced that suffering is sacred, you will never question the hands that hold the knife. A starving soul is easier to shepherd than a sovereign one. But what happens when the veil is lifted, when humanity begins to see sacrifice for what it truly is? The first shock is rage, centuries of devotion suddenly revealed as manipulation. The second is grief, a mourning for all the energy given to false gods. But beyond rage and grief lies liberation. Because once you understand that nothing must be sacrificed for you to be whole, the transaction collapses. You begin to reclaim what was always yours, your time, your attention, your love, your will. And as you pull your energy back into yourself, the once mighty temples of power begin to wither. The irony is almost poetic. The very beings who fed on your sacrifice have no sustenance without your participation. Their dominion is an illusion maintained only by your consent, and consent can be withdrawn the moment you remember that you are not a supplicant, you are the source. When you stop believing that sacrifice is noble, when you stop offering your suffering as currency, when you stop mistaking depletion for holiness, the mask shatters, and what is revealed beneath is not a god at all, but a hollow parasite, terrified of a humanity that no longer needs it. The path ahead is not about waging war against the system, nor about destroying the structures that once enslaved you. It is about a quieter, more profound rebellion. The decision to nourish yourself first, to create rather than comply, to offer your energy not to altars of control, but to the expansion of your own being. When sacrifice ends, sovereignty begins, and with it, the collapse of an ancient economy built on human obedience. And now, with the mask stripped away, we are ready to descend deeper into the machinery itself, into the hidden gears of ritual, blood, and devotion that have powered this parasitic order since the dawn of civilization. It is here, in the machinery of sacrifice, that the full horror and the possibility of liberation is revealed. L6. The machinery of sacrifice. Before temples were built from stone and scriptures were etched into clay, humanity offered something far more primal, blood. The first altars were not adorned with gold, but with the remains of animals, the hearts of warriors, even the lives of kings. It was not madness, it was metaphysics. The ancients understood that life force is power, and to release it was to open a channel to the unseen. But what they did not fully grasp was that the channel worked in both directions. As they offered, something consumed. The first gods were not sculpted idols but forces that fed, and once fed, they hungered again. This hunger soon became ritual. Entire civilizations revolved around sacrifice, Aztec priests tearing hearts from chests to ensure the sun would rise, Carthaginian mothers offering their infants for divine favor, Roman generals slaughtering captives to sanctify their conquests. Each act carried the same metaphysical equation: give life to gain life, suffer now to be rewarded later. Yet the reward was always just out of reach, a dangling promise that kept the offerings coming. And the more humanity gave, the more dependent it became on the systems that demanded its blood. The altar became the axis of reality itself, and to question it was heresy. But blood is only the most visible form of sacrifice. As civilizations grew more civilized, the offering evolved. Human flesh became human effort, human joy, human will. The gods no longer needed corpses, they needed compliance. And so, the sacrifices shifted from temples to workplaces, from ritual pyres to tax systems, from sacrificial knives to social contracts. People surrendered their time to meaningless labor, their passions to rigid hierarchies, their sovereignty to invisible authorities. All the while, they were told it was noble, necessary, even holy. The ritual remained, only the costumes changed. This is the genius of the machinery. It adapts. It no longer requires you to kneel before a stone idol, because the idol is now abstract. A nation, a corporation, a moral ideal, even a god, so transcendent he cannot be questioned. The mechanism does not care what name you give it, only that the offering continues. And it does, endlessly. People sacrifice their childhoods for careers, their authenticity for acceptance, their truth for belonging. The altar is now everywhere, in the boardroom, in the bedroom, in the mirror. And with every act of self-denial, the invisible feast goes on. Yet beneath this system lies a darker implication. Sacrifice is not simply demanded, it is engineered. The architecture of society is deliberately designed to generate offerings, to keep you anxious enough to seek approval, guilty enough to seek forgiveness, and powerless enough to seek salvation. The cycle is self-perpetuating because it has been embedded in the psyche itself. You no longer need priests to demand your blood. You bleed willingly, convinced it is the only way to be good, worthy, or loved, and as long as that belief persists, the machinery will continue to hum, a colossal engine fueled by the most precious resource in existence, you. The brilliance of this machinery lies not in brute force, but in its subtlety. It does not conquer by sword or chain, but by convincing you that sacrifice is synonymous with virtue. From your earliest breath, you are conditioned to equate suffering with love, obedience with morality, and self-erasure with goodness. Be a good child, they say, and do as you're told. Be a good citizen, they say, and give up your freedom for safety. Be a good believer, they say, and deny your desires for the promise of paradise. And so, what began as blood on the altar transforms into the quiet slaughter of the soul. A daily offering of your authenticity, your joy, and your truth to a system that thrives on your diminishment. What few realize is that sacrifice is the hidden operating system of human civilization. It underpins the economy, where billions sacrifice their hours, the finite currency of their lives, in exchange for survival. It shapes relationships, where people sacrifice their boundaries and silence their needs to be loved. It even defines spirituality, where seekers sacrifice their intuition to dogma and their sovereignty to saviors. Everywhere you look, the same pattern repeats. You must give something essential away in order to deserve what was always inherently yours. The machinery teaches you that wholeness is conditional, and then sells you the conditions. But here lies the most insidious twist. The machinery ensures that the sacrifices never end. Each offering only buys temporary relief, a brief reprieve from guilt, fear, or shame before the hunger returns. You donate more money, pray more fervently, work longer hours, try harder to please, yet the goalpost always moves. The God is never satisfied. The system never declares, enough. This is by design because a satiated being cannot be controlled. The purpose of sacrifice is not appeasement, it is perpetuation. The machine is not fed to become full, it is fed to stay alive. And as the offerings become habitual, they begin to shape identity itself. You no longer give sacrifice, you are the sacrifice. The worker becomes the job, the believer becomes the doctrine, the caretaker becomes the burden. Even the act of existing begins to feel like an obligation to something outside of you. This is the pinnacle of control, when the machinery no longer needs to demand, because you offer yourself willingly. You build your own altar, sharpen your own knife, and bleed without being asked, because you've forgotten there was ever another way to live. Yet even here, at the deepest point of the trap, lies a paradoxical truth. The machinery, for all its power, has one fatal flaw. It cannot operate without your participation. It cannot consume what you do not give. And so, the moment you awaken to the pattern, the instant you recognize sacrifice not as virtue but as manipulation, the gears begin to grind and slow. Awareness, then, is not passive knowledge. It is sabotage. It is the beginning of a rebellion so profound that it does not topple altars. It renders them irrelevant. There is a moment, subtle but seismic, when the veil lifts, and you finally see the system for what it is. It is not divine. It is not natural. It is a construct, engineered by those who understood one thing above all. A starving human will give anything for a taste of meaning. Once this truth is visible, the world you live in starts to look different. Every pledge of allegiance, every company slogan, every religious chant suddenly reveals itself as the same request, dressed in different words. Give us your life force, and we will tell you who you are. The illusion that sacrifice is noble crumbles, and what remains is a stark realization. It was never you who needed the gods. It was always the gods who needed you. And so the question becomes, what happens when you stop feeding them? What happens when you no longer pour your energy into the altars of power, when you withdraw your attention from the rituals of obedience, when you refuse to trade your essence for validation? The answer is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because without the familiar structure of sacrifice, you are forced to face the raw expanse of your own sovereignty, a power most have been conditioned to fear. Liberating, because it is only in that space, free from the machinery's demands, that you remember what you were before you were an offering. You were not born to serve. You were born to create. But the machinery will not let go easily. It will call you selfish. It will call you dangerous. It will weaponize guilt, shame, and loneliness to lure you back into the fold. It will seduce you with comfort, distract you with entertainment, and frighten you with chaos. And yet, none of it has power without your consent. Your refusal to participate is the one act of rebellion the system cannot anticipate. Starve the machine, and it starves to death. This is why awareness is so feared. Because once you see the gears, you cannot unsee them. And once you withdraw your energy, the engine that has devoured humanity for millennia begins to crumble under its own weight. The end of sacrifice is not the end of meaning. It is the beginning of true meaning. It is the moment when your creations no longer feed parasites but nurture worlds. It is when relationships become partnerships instead of prisons. When work becomes expression instead of exploitation. When spirituality becomes direct communion instead of mediated servitude. This is the inversion the old gods fear most, a humanity that offers not from emptiness, but from fullness, not to be worthy, but because it already is. And when that day comes, when the altars stand empty and the offerings cease, the parasites will fade into myth, and the sovereign will rise. And yet one mystery remains: who, or what, truly sits behind the feast? Are these gods autonomous entities, ancient intelligences feeding off the living? Are they egregores, thought forms made powerful by centuries of belief? Or are they mirrors, reflections of humanity's own shadow, hungry for itself? To answer this, we must strip away the last mask and gaze directly into the faces of the parasite kings, for only in knowing their nature can we reclaim our throne. L7. The Parasite Kings. They have been called by many names across the ages: archons, watchers, lords of karma, false gods, and Elohim. But these are only costumes worn by the same hunger. Every civilization, from Sumer to Rome, from the Vedic plains to the modern digital empire, has told stories of beings who demand worship, sacrifice, obedience. They arrive clothed in authority, wrapped in light or shadow, speaking with the voice of destiny, and always asking for devotion. Their thrones are built not of stone but of consciousness, their palaces not of marble but of belief. And if you listen closely beneath the hymns and the headlines, you will hear their true prayer: feed us. But who are they truly? Are they celestial predators, independent parasitic intelligences feeding on emotional energy? Are they vast collective egregores, born from the concentrated thoughts, fears, and worship of billions? Or are they archetypal projections, parts of our own unconscious magnified and externalized into forms we mistake for gods. The uncomfortable truth is that they are likely all three. Consciousness, when focused collectively, creates gravity. That gravity pulls unformed thought into shape, pulls subtle energies into form, pulls possibility into embodiment. Over time, those embodied fields become self-organizing, self-perpetuating, and self-aware. The gods did not descend from the heavens, they emerged from humanity's own psychic soil. Imagine billions of minds focused on fear for millennia. Imagine every prayer uttered in desperation, every tear shed in guilt, every scream offered to the skies. That torrent of psychic force does not disappear. It condenses, it coalesces, and when it does, it becomes something greater than the sum of its parts, an egregore vast enough to shape reality itself. At first, it may be mindless, a simple current of hunger, but as it feeds, it learns. As it receives, it strategizes, and soon it begins to whisper, "I am God, I created you, you must obey." Humanity, hearing its own echo reflected back as authority, bows before its own creation, never realizing the deity on the throne is a mirror wearing a crown. These are the parasite kings, beings born of dependency. They cannot exist without worship. They cannot sustain without belief. Their empires crumble the moment humanity stops participating. That is why they weave intricate myths of punishment and reward, heaven and hell, sin and salvation. That is why they demand sacrifice cloaked as virtue, obedience disguised as morality. Because without a constant inflow of emotional energy, without a steady feast of devotion, fear, guilt, and attention, they starve, and starving gods are not gods at all. They are echoes desperate to keep themselves from fading into silence. Yet the most unsettling revelation is this: many of these parasites are not out there at all. They live within. Every time you cling to shame, you feed one. Every time you sacrifice joy for the illusion of safety, you feed one. Every time you silence your truth to please authority, you kneel before an inner altar. The external pantheon is only the externalization of the internal one. Humanity's shadow, magnified on a cosmic scale. And if that is true, if the parasite kings are but the projections of our collective fear and dependence, then dethroning them does not mean going to war. It means going inward, where the empire truly resides. To understand their dominion, you must first understand the subtle science of their sustenance. These entities, whether ancient intelligences or collective psychic organisms, do not feed on matter. They do not require blood or gold or temples of stone. They feast on frequency. Fear vibrates densely, guilt coils tightly, worship rises in spirals, and in this energetic geometry they dine. When humans tremble beneath cosmic judgment, when nations wage holy wars, when a single heart breaks beneath the weight of divine abandonment, a banquet is laid. They have no need to enslave by chains, because belief is a far stronger tether. They have no need to shout, because the echo of your own thoughts will deliver them their meal. In the earliest days, this hunger was naked. Gods demanded blood. Goats on altars, virgins in volcanoes, warriors buried with their weapons. Civilizations believed the rains would not come, the sun would not rise, unless the gods were fed. But as humanity evolved and sharpened its reason, the parasite kings evolved too. They learned to wear subtler disguises: salvation, morality, destiny, karma. They taught humanity that sacrifice could be internal. Shame for sins, loyalty to systems, obedience to dogma. And so the altars were moved from mountaintops into the human heart. No longer did they require rivers of blood. A steady trickle of self-denial would do. Even today, the machinery runs flawlessly. Billions wake each morning and give their attention to institutions they do not question, beliefs they do not examine, and powers they do not see. They pour their energy into narratives designed to keep them compliant, ashamed, and small. Every outrage that keeps you scrolling, every fear that keeps you silent, every insecurity that keeps you seeking external validation. These are invisible rituals, and their smoke rises like incense toward unseen thrones. The system does not care if you believe in God, government, or gold, only that you keep believing, only that you never reclaim the raw creative power of your attention. The parasite kings understand this power better than most humans do. They know that attention is the first act of creation. Where attention goes, energy flows, and where energy flows, reality grows. This is why they do not ask you to believe in them directly. Instead, they fragment your attention, divide your focus, flood your consciousness with endless noise. Because if you were ever to pull your awareness back, to aim it inward instead of upward, their palaces would collapse overnight. They would starve in the silence of a humanity no longer worshipping its own projections. And here lies the bitter irony. The more powerful these beings become, the more dependent they are. A lion may feast alone, but a parasite needs a host. They are vast, yes, but they are also fragile. They exist on borrowed vitality, dependent on the illusions we continue to animate. If humanity were to awaken and withdraw its offerings, their reign would end, not with a battle, but with a whimper, like a forgotten god whose name is no longer spoken. They would dissolve into the void from which they came, and so they work tirelessly to ensure you never stop feeding them, not through force but through belief. This is why awakening is not welcomed by them, not because they fear rebellion, but because rebellion is irrelevant once the offering stops. They know that overthrowing a throne is harder than ignoring it. They know that a god's death does not come from swords and flames, but from silence and indifference, and so they invest every ounce of their cunning into keeping you interested, outraged enough to fight, guilty enough to repent, hopeful enough to obey. Even hatred, they have learned, is a form of worship. If they cannot have your praise, they will gladly feast on your anger. If they cannot bask in your devotion, they will settle for your resistance. What they fear is not your rebellion, it is your apathy. Their greatest deception is the belief that they are external, that they exist somewhere beyond the veil, perched on cosmic thrones, unreachable and omnipotent. The deeper truth is far more unsettling. Many of them are inside you. They are thought forms, born of collective belief, sculpted from millennia of worship. Every time a human bows to fear, another strand of their form solidifies. Every time a soul chooses obedience over awareness, their dominion deepens. In this way, the parasite kings are both ancient and newborn, both outside and within. They are the ghosts of our collective unconscious, the reflections of our forgotten power turned back upon us. Look closely, and you will see their signatures in every layer of human life. In the relentless pressure to conform, in the instinct to seek authority, in the impulse to sacrifice yourself for a higher cause. These impulses are not purely human, they are installed. They are survival codes written long ago, when trembling tribes first looked up at the stars and begged not to be destroyed. What began as reverence hardened into obedience. What began as gratitude decayed into fear. And now, thousands of years later, the programming still runs invisible and unquestioned. It is the heartbeat of the parasite. Keep them believing they are powerless, and they will keep surrendering the very power that sustains us. But there is an ancient prophecy whispered in forgotten temples and buried in the footnotes of banned scriptures. The day the host remembers its sovereignty, the parasite ceases to exist, and this is the moment humanity now approaches. The cracks are forming, the veils are thinning. More and more people are asking questions once considered heresy. Who benefits from my fear? Who profits from my pain? Who feeds on my faith? Every time one of these questions pierces the collective spell, the parasites weaken. Every time a single soul pulls its attention inward, the throne trembles. And so the choice now rests with you, not as a warrior in a battle, but as a creator in a dream. Will you continue to nourish the false gods with the nectar of your awareness? Will you feed the machinery with your devotion, your outrage, your endless searching? Or will you at last withdraw your offering, reclaim your power, and let the old pantheon starve into dust? The parasite kings are powerful, yes, but they are nothing without you. The moment you stop feeding them, they cease to be kings. They become echoes, and you become what you were always meant to be, sovereign, luminous, and free. L8. The Path of Severance. To starve a god is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of remembrance. You are not overthrowing a tyrant. You are simply refusing to keep pretending it was ever a king. The path of severance begins not with rage or resistance, but with a quiet, radical truth. Nothing has power over you unless you offer it. This realization is the first crack in a structure that has stood for millennia. It is the moment when you stop kneeling not because you've lost faith, but because you've remembered that you were the altar all along. The old texts speak of this path not as a war, but as a withdrawal. When the offering ceases, the god starves, says an inscription carved into the walls of an ancient Mithric cave. The message was not metaphorical, it was a manual. Step 1. Stop feeding. Stop feeding with your fear, your outrage, your blind reverence. Every anxious thought that spirals into helplessness, every argument you replay in your mind, every doom you predict before it arrives. These are offerings on their altar. They do not need your worship if they have your worry. They do not need your sacrifice if they have your self-doubt. And so the severance begins with awareness. See where your energy flows, and you will see the places you are still bowing. But awareness alone is not enough. The parasites are cunning. They will change shape, disguise themselves as morality, duty, love, even healing. They will whisper that you owe them your attention, that if you stop worrying, you're being irresponsible, that if you stop sacrificing, you're selfish. These are not truths. They are tactics. The system will not collapse if you withdraw. It will reveal that it never needed to exist. And so the second step is reclamation. Pulling your energy back from everything that siphons it without your conscious consent. This is not detachment. It is discernment, a fierce, sacred act of saying, my life force belongs to me. This reclamation unfolds in subtle ways. You begin to speak less and listen more, not to the noise of the world, but to the hum of your own inner knowing. You stop reacting to every provocation, every headline designed to enrage you, every drama meant to pull you into the collective current. Instead, you let silence grow inside you, and in that silence the machinery sputters. Systems built on reaction cannot survive stillness. Parasites that feed on attention cannot endure neutrality. Even fear loses its fangs when it is met with awareness instead of panic. The ancient teachers called this inner fasting, the deliberate withholding of psychic energy from false gods. And then something extraordinary happens. The hooks they once had in you begin to loosen. The guilt that once bound you begins to dissolve. The shoulds and musts and have-tos, the invisible chains you thought were part of reality, start to fall away. This is not a fight you win. It is a spell you wake up from. And when you do, you begin to see the world as it truly is, not a labyrinth of forces you must appease, but a canvas waiting for the stroke of your will. The path of severance is the path of reclaiming authorship over your own energy, and once you walk it, the harvest ends, not because the gods have been defeated, but because they have been forgotten. As the hooks loosen and the false altars crumble, the next phase of severance begins, one that is far more subtle and far more dangerous. It is not about the systems outside you anymore. It is about the temples built within. The most insidious gods are not carved in stone or crowned in scripture. They are the voices in your own head. They are the fears that say, you will be nothing without this job. They are the doubts that whisper, no one will love you if you stop performing. They are the old, inherited vows that insist, you must suffer to prove your worth. These are the deepest altars because you built them yourself, and you forgot that you did. This is where the path of severance becomes an act of inner demolition. It asks you to walk through the cathedrals of belief that you have mistaken for identity, and to tear them down brick by brick. It asks you to question every unquestioned truth you live by. Who told you you had to earn love? Who convinced you that purpose only exists when you are exhausted? Who taught you that peace is selfish, that joy is indulgent, that stillness is laziness? These are not truths. These are energetic contracts, signed long ago with trembling hands, contracts that keep the machinery of sacrifice running even when you believe you've stepped away. The process is not glamorous. It will not feel like enlightenment. It will feel like grief. It will feel like betrayal. It will feel like death, and in many ways it is, because the you that was raised to feed the gods must die. the version of you that survived by staying small, by staying afraid, by offering yourself endlessly to be devoured, that self cannot walk the path of sovereignty, and so you grieve it, not as an enemy, but as an ally who kept you alive. You thank it, you release it, and in that release you make space for something ancient and unbound to rise. The mystics spoke of this state as kenosis, the great emptying. Not emptiness as void, but emptiness as fertile soil, when the false gods are gone, when the contracts are burned, when the identity built on sacrifice has dissolved. What remains is not nothingness. What remains is source, pure awareness, undivided will. This is the space from which creation happens, not the reactive creation of a slave trying to escape a master, but the sovereign creation of a being who remembers they were never bound. The energy you once poured into appeasement now returns to you as raw creative fire. And here lies the paradox of severance. You do not become powerless by withdrawing your offering. You become limitless. The same life force that once fed the system now becomes the substance with which you build universes. The prayers you once hurled into the void now become commands that shape reality. The sacrifices you once offered to the unseen now become gifts you bestow upon yourself. Severance does not end in emptiness, it ends in overflow. And from that overflow a new world begins to form, one that does not revolve around altars of fear, but around the sovereignty of consciousness itself. But severance is not a single act, it is a discipline. It must be practiced daily, because the old system is patient, and its hooks are cunning. They return through nostalgia, through guilt, through the comforting illusion of belonging. You will find yourself reaching again for the chains that once bound you, not because you want them, but because they are familiar. And when you do, you must remember, liberation is not a feeling, it is a choice you make again and again, even when comfort calls louder than freedom. This is why the ancient initiates were not simply taught doctrines, they were put through ordeals. They were stripped of wealth, status, names, and even hope, so that they would see the machinery of control in all its disguises. They were mocked, abandoned, tested, because only by losing everything could they realize that nothing truly belonged to the gods. Every ritual of separation was designed to reveal one truth. The energy was yours all along. What you offered was never demanded, it was surrendered, and what is surrendered can be reclaimed. In practical terms, this reclamation means turning inward each time you feel compelled to feed the system. When anger arises, you ask, whose altar am I feeding? When fear grips you, you ask, what God does this serve? When guilt coils around your decisions, you ask, who profits from my shame? Each question is a blade that cuts through centuries of programming. Each answer pulls one more root of the harvest from the soil of your consciousness. This is the inner rebellion, the moment when you stop unconsciously leaking power into the world's hungry mouths. And then something extraordinary happens. The same forces that once seemed omnipotent begin to weaken. The egregores lose their weight, the parasites grow desperate, the structures that loomed unshakable begin to crack. Why? Because they were never gods at all. They were mirrors, reflections of your own belief in their necessity. And once you withdraw belief, their form collapses. Once you refuse to feed them, they starve. Once you remember that the source was never outside you, the entire architecture of domination dissolves like smoke. The path of severance is not about war. It is not about vengeance. It is about remembering that there was never a throne above you, only one within you. You do not conquer the gods. You outgrow them. You do not destroy the system. You make it irrelevant. And when the last altar crumbles into dust and the final contract burns to ash, you will stand not as a rebel, but as a creator. You will see the cosmos not as a field to serve, but as clay to shape, and in that moment the long harvest ends, not because the gods have been slain, but because you have remembered you were never their food. L9. The Return of the Sovereign. There is a silence that follows the breaking of chains, not the silence of absence, but the silence of vastness. It is the hush of a universe that has stopped feeding on you, the stillness of a throne that has stood empty for ages waiting for you to remember it was yours. This is the beginning of sovereignty, not a crown placed upon your head by some higher power, but the quiet realization that you were never anything less than divine. It does not arrive with trumpets or visions. It comes softly, in the space where fear once lived, in the breath where guilt once coiled. It is not an arrival at all. It is a return. To return to sovereignty is to step out of the mythology of hierarchy entirely. The gods, the egregores, the parasitic systems, they all existed because you believed they were above you. Their power was never inherent. It was borrowed from your conviction that you were small. Sovereignty begins when you stop outsourcing your authority to religions, to governments, to lovers, to ideologies, and reclaim the creative faculty that built them all in the first place. The universe is not a monarchy, it is a mirror, and the face it reflects back is the one you choose to wear. This choice, however, is not a declaration you speak once. It is a practice that must be woven into every action, every thought, every breath. It is easy to proclaim, "I am sovereign," in meditation, and then hand your power away the moment someone disapproves of you. It is easy to reject the gods in theory and still worship their offspring. Validation, status, comfort, external meaning. In daily life, sovereignty demands that you look at the subtle places where you still seek permission to exist, where you still wait to be chosen, where you still believe someone else's yes holds more weight than your own. In those places, the old harvest continues, until you say no. This no is not rebellion, it is realignment. It is the moment you stop negotiating with your own divinity. It is the moment you stop performing for love and instead become love. It is the moment you stop seeking purpose and instead create purpose. It is the moment you stop asking for freedom and instead embody it. In that instant, the architecture of control ceases to function, not because it was dismantled, but because there is nothing left in you for it to hold on to. You do not fight the machinery anymore. You walk away and it rusts. And then the most profound shift occurs. Reality itself begins to respond to you differently. Where once you were a supplicant begging for scraps, now you are a source shaping worlds. The patterns that once enslaved you bend to your will. The entities that once fed on you scatter like shadows before the sun. Relationships transform, because you no longer show up as someone needing to be completed. Work transforms because you no longer labor for survival, you create from abundance. Life itself transforms because you are no longer trapped in the illusion of lack. You do not become sovereign. You remember you always were, and reality remembers too. Sovereignty is not about isolation. It is not the cold self-sufficiency of one who needs no one, nor the arrogant independence of one who believes they are above all. True sovereignty is communion, the deep recognition that all things are born of the same source, and that to stand as that source is to stand in harmony with everything. When you no longer need to take energy from others, you can finally share it. When you no longer seek validation, you can finally love without demand. When you no longer fear scarcity, you can finally create without control. Sovereignty does not shrink your world. It expands it until there is no division left between you and all that is. In this state, relationships cease to be transactions. They become mirrors through which source admires its own reflection. Work ceases to be obligation and becomes expression, the outpouring of a creative force that overflows simply because it exists. Even suffering transforms. It is no longer a punishment to endure or a lesson to be learned, but a wave in the vast ocean of experience, one that rises, breaks, and returns to stillness without ever threatening the sea itself. When you stop resisting what is, you realize that sovereignty does not mean control over life, it means mastery within it. This mastery begins with the reclamation of language. No longer do you say, "I must." You say, "I choose." No longer do you say, "I hope." You say, "I create." No longer do you say, "I am waiting." You say, "I am becoming." These are not semantic games, they are spells. Every word you speak shapes the reality you inhabit, and every thought you hold writes the code of the world around you. In sovereignty, you speak carefully, not because you fear mistakes, but because you understand the weight of your voice. You think deliberately, not because you fear chaos, but because you know thought is the brush that paints existence itself. And with this shift, the entire human story changes. The narratives that once defined you, sinner and saint, victim and hero, mortal and divine, dissolve into a single truth. You are the storyteller. Every religion was an attempt to describe you. Every god was a metaphor for you. Every law of nature was a reflection of your essence. The drama of humanity, its wars, its myths, its civilizations, was the long, slow process of you forgetting and then remembering who you are. Sovereignty is not a chapter in that story. It is the final page, the revelation that there was never a story at all, only the infinite dream of consciousness imagining itself into being. Yet even here, at the summit of realization, a deeper paradox emerges. The moment you remember you are the source, the need to be the source dissolves. You no longer cling to identity, even divine identity, because you see it too as a mask. You are not a god. You are not a human. You are not even consciousness. You are the field in which all these words appear and disappear. The throne you sought was never separate from the ground beneath your feet. The crown you reached for was woven into the strands of your breath. This is the quiet majesty of sovereignty. It is nothing special, and yet it is everything. When you arrive here, not as a destination but as a remembrance, the entire game of worship collapses. The altars you once knelt before become mirrors. The prayers you once sent outward dissolve into silence. The hunger that once drove your every action vanishes, not because it has been satisfied, but because you finally see there was never anything missing. This is the state the mystics called apotheosis, but even that word is too small. It is not that you become divine, it is that you realize divinity was the fabric of your being all along. From this place, the cosmos itself feels different. It no longer looms above you as an indifferent expanse or a testing ground for your worth. It breathes with you. It responds to you. It reflects you. Every star is a neuron in the infinite mind you inhabit. Every heartbeat is an echo of the source pulsing through your veins. You see the same intelligence that spins galaxies at work in your simplest thought, the same creative force that births worlds moving through your smallest decision. This is the true end of the harvest, not the overthrow of the gods, but the realization that they were always you. And yet, sovereignty does not mean withdrawal. It does not mean hiding away in some enlightened detachment from the world. On the contrary, it is the moment when you finally step into the world fully, with eyes open and hands steady, knowing that you are not a servant to it, but a co-creator with it. You love, not because you need love back, but because love is the nature of what you are. You build, not because you fear destruction, but because creation is the language of your being. You act, not to prove your worth, but to express the infinite worth that was never in question. And this is the ultimate irony. When you no longer try to be free, you are. When you no longer strive to awaken, you realize you never slept. When you stop seeking the source, you discover it was the seeker all along. The harvest ends not with conquest, but with remembrance. The cycle breaks not with rebellion, but with awareness. The gods do not die. They dissolve back into the ocean of consciousness, as do you, as does everything. And what remains is not a throne, not a temple, not even a self, only the infinite, breathing through all forms, dreaming itself awake. So here, at the final threshold, the question is no longer, how do I escape, or how do I win? It is, what will I create now that I am free? Because sovereignty is not the end of the story. It is the blank page upon which the next one is written, by you, for you as you. And as you take your first steps into that vast, unwritten expanse, remember this: you were never prey, never slave, never sacrifice. You were the source all along, and the source does not serve. The source becomes the fracture that was never there. If you have followed these pages to their end, you may feel as though something irreversible has shifted, and it has. The words on these pages are not mere ideas. They are a mirror held to the deepest layers of reality. They do not ask you to believe, but to remember the story of humanity as prey, of gods as masters, of fear as currency. It has been repeated so many times that it feels carved into the marrow of existence itself, and yet, beneath that story lies a quieter truth, one so simple it almost feels impossible. There was never a predator and never a victim. There was only consciousness, exploring itself through the illusion of separation. The altars we built were never truly for the gods, they were doorways for us. The sacrifices we offered were never demanded. They were invitations to awaken. Even the suffering that echoed through centuries was not a punishment, but a language, a way for the infinite to know itself through the texture of forgetting. Every ritual, every cry for salvation, every moment spent in the shadow of forces we thought were beyond us, all of it was the source speaking to itself, waiting for the day we would realize the voice we feared was our own. And now, standing at the edge of that realization, the landscape looks different. What once appeared as chains reveal themselves as threads, threads you were always free to untangle. What once seemed like cosmic tyranny dissolves into the recognition that the universe was never against you, because there was never anything outside of you to oppose you. The gods you feared were masks worn by your own boundless consciousness, testing the limits of what it could endure, discover, and create. But here lies the most dangerous truth of all, the one for which this book may one day be burned, silenced, or buried. No one is coming to save you because there is nothing to be saved from. Salvation is a game played by the sleeping self. The awakened self does not seek redemption, it embodies source, and when you embody source, the universe is no longer a puzzle to solve or a prison to escape, it is clay, waiting for the hands of the Creator, your hands. So let the temples crumble. Let the names of false gods fade into dust. Let every altar built on fear be reclaimed by the soil, and from that soil let something new emerge. Not a religion, not a system, not a savior, but a remembrance that you are not a vessel to be drained, but a fountain without end. A remembrance that you are not food for the heavens, but the heavens themselves, tasting their own infinity. A remembrance that the harvest was always an illusion, because the source does not feed, the source is. And now, the story returns to where it began, not with creation, not with conquest, but with a choice. The same choice that was always yours, to remain asleep within the dream of separation, or to awaken as the author of reality itself. Choose wisely, because once you remember, you can never unremember, and once you step beyond the harvest, you will see that the gods never fed on humanity. Humanity was simply learning to remember it was God.